Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Just Around Midnight, Rock and Roll and the Racial Imagination by Jack Hamilton. Narrated by Ron Butler. Introduction. Dreams and Nightmares. In January of 1973, the same month that the Rolling Stones were banned from touring Japan due to prior drug convictions, the same month that a band called Kiss, or Kiss, played its first gig in Queens, and the same month that a young New Jerseyan named Bruce Springsteen released his debut album on Columbia Records, Harper's Magazine published an essay by future Pulitzer Prize winner Margot Jefferson entitled Ripping Off Black Music. The piece was partly a broad historical overview of white appropriations of black musical forms, from blackface minstrel pioneer T.D. Rice through the current day, and partly a more personal lament over what Jefferson, an African-American critic, had come to see as an incorrigible and endless cycle of cultural plunder. The article's most striking moment arrived in its penultimate paragraph. The night Jimmy died, I dreamed this was the latest step in a plot being designed to eliminate blacks from rock music so that it may be recorded in history as a creation of whites. Future generations, my dream ran, will be taught that while rock may have had its beginnings among blacks, it had its true flowering among whites. The best black artists will thus be studied as remarkable primitives who unconsciously foreshadowed future developments. That Jefferson's dream came true is so obvious it seems self-evident. According to anthropologist Maureen Mann, by the mid-1970s, young black musicians who wanted to play songs by Led Zeppelin and Grand Funk Railroad recalled being ridiculed by white and black peers. In July of 1979, thousands of white rock fans rioted at Chicago's Comiskey Park at the now mythic Disco Demolition Night, burning disco records in what many since have described as an anti-black, anti-gay, anti-woman reactionary uprising. In 1985, the Hollywood blockbuster Back to the Future featured a climactic sequence in which history is altered so that Chuck Berry's sound is retroactively invented by a Van Halen-obsessed white teenager. By 2011, when a popular New York classic rock radio station held a listener poll to determine the top 1,043 songs of all time, only 22, roughly 2%, were recordings by African-American artists, and 16 of those 22 were by the late Jimi Hendrix, the Jimmy of Jefferson's Dream, the lone black performer whose place in rock music hagiography is entirely secure. Jefferson's words were accurate, and it's tempting to call them prophetic, but they weren't. Jefferson's nightmare had in fact come true before she wrote her article, even before the night Jimmy died. When Hendrix passed away in 1970, one prominent obituary pointedly described him as a black man in the alien world of rock. And throughout Hendrix's tragically brief stardom, the guitarist's race had been an incessant topic of fascination among fans of the music that had once been known as rock and roll. Even in the late 1960s, the hypervisibility of Hendrix's race confirmed a racial imagination of rock music that was quickly rendering blackness invisible. So much so that at the time of his death, the idea of a black man playing electric lead guitar was literally remarkable, alien, in a way that would have been inconceivable for Chuck Berry only a short while earlier. This is a book about how this happened, how rock and roll music, a genre rooted in African-American traditions, and many of whose earliest stars were black, came to be understood as the natural province of whites. Moreover, this is a book about how and why this happened during a decade generally understood to be marked by unprecedented levels of interracial aesthetic exchange, musical collaboration, and commercial crossover more broadly. Many of the most famous moments of 1960s music are marked by interracial fluidity. a young Bob Dylan's transformation of a 19th century anti-slavery anthem, "No More Auction Block for Me," into the basis for a song that would become one of the most indelible musical works of the American Civil Rights era. Or the revolution of Motown Records, in which a black American entrepreneur actually bet against the racism of white America and won, and in doing so, created the most successful African American owned business in the country. Or the previously unimaginable inundation of groups from England, most notably a quartet from Liverpool called the Beatles, and a quintet from London called the Rolling Stones, both of whom were tireless evangelists for black American music, and would soon hear their own songs performed, frequently, by the very musicians they once idolized. And of course, there was Aretha Franklin, the Memphis-born and Detroit-raised daughter of one of America's most famous black preachers, who linked up with a band of white Southerners and transformed R&B music. And Jimi Hendrix himself, a black man from Seattle who joined up with a couple of white Englishmen in London and transformed the possibilities of the electric guitar. If, then, by the time of Hendrix's death, rock and roll music had in fact become white, how did this happen, and why? And perhaps most importantly, if rock and roll music did become white, what does it even mean to say such a thing? What ideological forces and cultural logics conspire to ally the audible imaginary of music with the visual imaginary of race? These are questions that we often assume we know the answers to. After all, to describe a singer as sounding black or sounding white is to gesture toward entire universes of ill-defined but widely understood aesthetic criteria. And yet, we rarely take the time to really ask them, to peel back everything that makes such descriptions both nonsensical and strangely common sense. If we fix our eyes and ears and step back far enough, the repeated disruptions and reconstitutions of this elision of race and sound begin to resemble something like the history of American music itself. This book sets out to tell two different yet interconnected stories simultaneously. The first story is of audience and discourse, the processes through which a musical culture rooted in interracialism came to imagine whiteness as its most basic stakes of authenticity. A fundamental panic that engulfed rock and roll's emergence was that the music's overtones of racial intermixture would threaten the social order. The infamous "Help Save the Youth of America, Don't Buy Negro Records" flyers circulated by white citizens' councils in the American South during the 1950s were not so much about stopping the circulation of black music in general, but rather about stopping the circulation of black music to young whites. And yet, by the end of the 1960s, the music had lost this character of racial disruption, to the point that black involvement was seen as flatly incongruous. This is a story of the forced marriage of musical and racial ideology, how ideas that people had long held about the innate qualities of black music and white music were fractured and then remade in newly powerful ways. This story takes place in many locations and through many conduits, and it follows the rise of a young generation of listeners eager to comment upon the sounds they were hearing, which culminated in the rise of a new literary figure, the rock critic. Written criticism, as much as musical criteria, Guthrie Ramsay reminds us, clearly determines the pedigree of a genre. In America, the institution of rock criticism would come to be largely synonymous with Rolling Stone magazine, started in San Francisco in 1967. And the magazine's enormous success was a pivotal happening in the history of popular music media. But people had been writing about the new music coming from Detroit, London, Liverpool, Greenwich Village, and elsewhere for nearly as long as they'd been hearing it. In local and national newspapers, in alternative weeklies and august prestige publications, in pioneering books, and tiny, passionate, fan magazines. In all of these venues, discussions and debates were held over what this music should and shouldn't sound like, be like, look like. And it is in these conversations, in their gathering ideologies and creeping omissions, that we can see the color of rock and roll begin to change. The second story is of music itself. The ways that artists and performers during this period negotiated and traversed racial divides to degrees unprecedented in the history of popular music. In some sense, this is a counterhistory to the previous one, an attempt to recover the resonances and possibilities in musical compositions, performances, and recordings, piecing together previously missed connections to reveal what Josh Kuhn calls audiotopia, an enacted, lived utopia that struggles against the constraints of racialization and nation-building. This story sets out to hear together musicians who have long been thought of as disparate, but who weren't necessarily thought to be so at the time, least of all in their own minds. For instance, one would never hear the Supremes on a rock radio station in the 21st century. Yet in May 1965, when Time magazine ran a story entitled Rock and Roll, Everybody's Turned On, the Supremes were on its cover. Similarly, Bob Dylan's credibility as a rock icon is unimpeachable. But in 1964, the year Sam Cooke released A Change Is Gonna Come, his landmark civil rights anthem inspired by Dylan's Blowin' in the Wind, no one would have thought to describe Dylan as a rock and roll singing star, as the Chicago Defender described Cooke while reporting on the singer's death that same year. Criticism, historiography, and popular discourse generally have accepted a view of popular music in the 1960s as split according to genre, and, more tacitly, race. On one hand is rock music, which is white. On the other, soul music, which is black. We hear Creedence Clearwater Revival's 1970 version of I Heard It Through the Grapevine as classic rock, the 662nd greatest classic rock song of all time, according to the aforementioned radio station poll. And we hear Marvin Gaye's slightly earlier version as something else, even though Gaye's version spent 7 weeks atop the charts in 1968 and 1969 and was clearly far more popular in its day among white and black listeners. As the previous paragraph suggests, these divisions didn't happen as naturally as we're often inclined to think. They took work. As Franco Fabri and Simon Frith have both argued, popular music genres are a collapsing of sociological and ideological arguments, indicating the social positions of performers and audiences, while also describing the ways these communities position themselves within and project themselves to the larger world. Rock and roll became white in large part because of stories people told themselves about it, stories that have come to structure the way we listen to an entire era of sound. In telling the story of those stories, I want to suggest ways to hear this music differently, more complexly, and more clearly. In other words, to hear it better. As Ingrid Monson has written, music is full of ideas that are evaluated by audiences and musicians, that acquire authority and prestige within particular aesthetic landscapes, and that are perceived to say something substantive about human experience and feeling. This statement seems particularly true of popular music, where processes of production, circulation, and reception are wide-ranging and fluid, and where the acquisition of authority and perception of what music says are often determined by ideological forces that far exceed the practice of musicians themselves. In American music, the construction of race has long been among the most powerful of these forces, and to best explore this relationship, I have embraced the term racial imagination, as set forth by Ronald Rodano and Philip Bowman, a concept that accepts a notion of race as profoundly extravisual, but avoids ideas of fixed racial essence and suggestions of race as a purely psychological construction. If race is a category that is constantly being produced and reproduced by social forces, as racial formation theory has long held, then race must be considered alongside forms of cultural production, particularly during a period in which popular music's real and imagined relation to social forces took on unprecedented intensity. Racial imagination, Rodano and Bowman tell us, is forever on the loose, subject to reformation within the memories and imaginations of the social as it blurs into other categories constituting difference, thus becoming a signification saturated with profound cultural meaning, and whose discursive instability heightens its effective power. Josh Kuhn puts this in the terms of popular music specifically, noting that race and popular music have always been experienced not alongside each other, not as complements, supplements, or corollaries of each other, but through each other. As the subtitle of this book suggests, the term that I choose to use to describe almost all of the music in these pages is rock and roll. There has often been a presumed generic gap between rock and roll and rock, the former indicating the teen-driven dance music of the 1950s and early 1960s, the latter something distinctly more high-minded. As one critic has it, rather than rock being just another mainstream music, it emerged in the mid-1960s as a way of stratifying mainstream musical consumption, as a means of creating higher and lower levels of popular music. By the end of the 1960s, this distinction was already being naturalized, either implicitly or explicitly, in some of the earliest and most foundational histories of the music. I am not so much out to deny that this shift happened. All music changes, after all. But rather to push at received tales of when it happened and how. I am skeptical of these tales, and this book reflects this skepticism in its content and its structure. For instance, as Chapter 2 shows, the most well-worn pairing qua dichotomy in rock history, that of the Beatles and Rolling Stones, emerged in this period. But this was largely a creation of media, particularly in the early years of their stardom. The contemporary music that the Beatles spoke of most enthusiastically was Motown. When Melody Maker asked John Lennon in 1964 to name a current hit he'd wished he'd written, he responded with Marvin Gaye's "Can I Get a Witness?" Thrice Told Stories. The whitening of rock and roll music is a subject that has generally been approached in one of three ways. The first is by casting the music's re-racialization as just one more iteration of a broadly transhistorical phenomenon of white-on-black cultural theft. In this telling, the appropriation of black musical styles by performers ranging from Elvis Presley to John Lennon to Janis Joplin is held as conceptually and ethically contiguous with a singular tradition of plunder most fundamentally exemplified in the practice of blackface minstrelsy. In its most reductive instances, this formulation rests on ideas of cultural ownership, essentialist originalism, and racial hermeticism. A belief that there is a clear and definable boundary between black music and white music in America that resists porosity. This belief does not hold up under basic scrutiny, and by abstracting black and white sound to monoliths, it obscures the fact that, as Carl Hagstrom Miller has written in his study of race and the early folk and pop music industries, the differences within African American or white music cultures were more extreme than the differences between black and white music cultures. This statement is just as applicable, if not likely more applicable, to the United States and United Kingdom of the 1960s as it is to the American South of the early 20th century. Less strident iterations of the theft narrative tend to employ minstrelsy as more of an explanatory metaphor. The publication of Eric Lott's Love and Theft, 1993, occasioned an ongoing explosion in critical and historical interest in minstrelsy, and the notions of counterfeit and thievery so explicitly on display in minstrelsy have obvious rhetorical utility when surveying the history of a popular music industry that's tended to grossly overcompensate white appropriators over black originators, from Paul Whiteman to Pat Boone to Iggy Azalea. But the minstrelsy metaphor is still flawed on several fronts. First, its transhistoricism leaves little room for differences between appropriations and exclusions, and it fails to reckon with the ever-changing character of both racial thought and expressive culture itself. As Lott and Alexander Saxton before him demonstrated, Northern antebellum blackface minstrelsy enacted and articulated a variety of specific cultural and political concerns that were surely different from those enacted by Elvis Presley, to say nothing of Mick Jagger. Abstracting minstrelsy into a soft, ahistorical formation that takes place primarily at the level of the imagination risks underplaying the real violence and inequities enacted by the history of actual blackface minstrelsy, as well as misunderstanding the diverse array of contexts and intentions that have informed white flirtations with non-white culture throughout American history. Moreover, while other African American popular musical forms like jazz, blues, and most recently hip-hop have long histories of white appropriation, the canons of these musics remain overwhelmingly black, whereas rock music has all but purged its hagiography of black musicians. As Elijah Wald writes, it is a profound irony that the attempts to make highbrow art out of jazz in the 1920s is generally recalled by historians as an embarrassing wrong turn, whereas the attempt to make highbrow art out of rock and roll in the 1960s is generally viewed as a step forward for the genre, which has been led by white artists ever since. This seems a crucial difference. No black-derived musical form in American history has more assiduously moved to erase and blockade black participation than rock music. When rock ideology purged itself of visible blackness, it was foreclosing not simply African American performers, but an entire young tradition of interracial fluidity. The second way that the whitening of rock and roll music has been addressed has been to place the onus of separation on black performers by arguing that, as the 1960s progressed, black music effectively self-segregated. In this narrative, the broad trajectory of black popular music is often directly linked to, if not conflated with, the broad trajectory of the civil rights movement, in which discourses of self-determination and, in more extreme cases, outright separatism became more pronounced in the later part of the decade. This is an intriguing argument with no small amount of truth. And of course, there have been a number of excellent and important histories of 1960s rhythm and blues music's relationship to the civil rights movement. As Chapter 4 here discusses, in the late 1960s, the near simultaneous ascendances of Aretha Franklin and Janis Joplin to superstardom helped produce a flurry of debates over soul, which were often themselves musical proxies for broader cultural and political discourses. That said, there are multiple flaws to the self-segregation narrative, starting with the fact that it tends to conflate music and activism, when the specifics of musicians' political commitments were often hazier. James Brown's 1968 hit, "Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud," spent 6 weeks atop the R&B charts and was a groundbreaking musical anthem of black power. Less than 6 months after its release, Brown performed at Richard Nixon's inauguration. Conversely, a performer like Nina Simone, who was outspoken in her political commitments and whose fierce dedication to the civil rights movement explicitly informed her music, operated mostly outside both the black and white commercial mainstreams. Suggesting that R&B music self-segregated implies that R&B music is a singular, unvarying monolith, a reduction that partakes in what Emily Lordy identifies as a tendency to treat entire genres of music as metaphors for culturally specific values like community. Even more importantly, the self-segregation narrative excuses the majority white side from any responsibility for the disappearance of black artists from rock music. For all of the late 1960s celebrations of soul on the part of African American writers, the belief that black music should be kept separate from white was also proselytized by white writers, and white critics were often just as vocal in policing boundaries of black musical authenticity. Which brings us to the third and by far most common way that the whitening of rock and roll music has been discussed. Simply, not at all. The history of rock discourse is marked by a profound aversion towards discussions of race, and attempts to reckon the music's racial exclusivity have often been met with hostility, particularly at the level of fandom. When Lester Bangs wrote an infamous cover story entitled The White Noise Supremacists for the Village Voice in 1979 about the racism of New York's punk and new wave scenes, he was met with outrage and accusations of betrayal. When Sasha Frere Jones wrote a similarly controversial piece for The New Yorker on the whiteness of indie rock in 2007, he was widely pilloried in the rock blogosphere. Neither of these essays are perfect works, particularly the Bangs, but the dismissiveness and sometimes outright vitriol with which they were met speak to the extent of rock's peculiar racial denialism. In historiography, this denialism conceals itself more subtly. The most common way is a tendency towards stories of individual rock genius that foreclose discussions of race by celebrating individual artistry and intellect. While many black performers of the 1960s have often been relegated to book-length histories of black music generally, white artists like Bob Dylan or the Beatles receive their own increasingly lavish biographies and hermetic critical treatments of musical output. In this disparity, we see a sort of critical corollary to what Fred Moten describes as white avant-gardism, whose seriousness requires either an active forgetting of black performances or a relegation of them to mere source material. From an even broader standpoint, the recognition of white people as individuals, while recognizing non-white people only in relation to collectives, is a hallmark of racism across all areas of culture. One might argue that the entire history of white supremacy rests upon it. An alternative to this great man tendency is a sort of nostalgic populism that glorifies rock and roll music for its democratizing folk elements. In these formulations, rock music is often folded into a quasi-mythic lineage of American proletarian expression, with class trumping race in narratives that claim rock and roll music as an inherently and nobly working-class form. Leaving aside that even a quick glimpse at history makes this difficult to corroborate, for each Elvis Presley, son of a Mississippi truck driver, there is a Buddy Holly, scion of relative affluence in Texas. The working classing of rock and roll tellingly manifests some of the same anxieties that haunted the New Left of the 1960s, a movement in which radical political ideology often rested uneasily against the middle-class background of its leaders. In the years since, the fantasy of rock music as a fundamentally proletarian, and hence subtly raceless, form has sometimes haunted left intellectuals writing on the music, within and outside the academy. An object lesson in this is the case of Bruce Springsteen, a figure whose salt-of-the-earth persona has helped him carve out a niche as rock's everyman for a rabid fan base that sprawls to include, at the time of this writing, even the conservative governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie. Springsteen's populist heroism is cited in terms of everything from his progressive pop.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?